Well, well, well. I finally was able to corner Dr. Michael Pohlen for an interview. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Happy to finally make it on.
I think we've been planning this in the background for, I don't know, probably years at this point.
That's probably about right.
You're like, only after this paper is done, only after this paper is done, should I hop on this show and have something to showcase? So it seems like you have a couple things lined up that we could talk about. But first, to introduce who you are and what you do. So I'll give my brief synopsis of you, and then you can edit me along the way. So Dr. Michael Pohlen did his medical school or his undergrad at Texas A&M, Gig'em, right?
Yeah, go.
Um,
Yep.
then went to Baylor College of Medicine for medical school. I think you were somewhat involved in their space medicine elective, which is fairly unique across medical schools.
Yeah. They have a space medicine pathway, and I can talk more about that if you'd like as well. But definitely, it was a great intro to the field.
And then went off to Stanford for a residency in radiology and has recently finished residency. So,
Yes,
and
yes. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Long and relatively well earned, I think. I hope.
and yeah, and then now you are, I believe, um, you have since moved and picked up a new job, but all along the way have been involved in space medicine. So that's kind of my brief summary for you. Did I get anything wrong?
No, that's pretty accurate. I do have a new job. The move is yet to come. I stuck around another year at Stanford. I'm doing a dual fellowship in cardiovascular and thoracic imaging right now. So a
Very
lot of
nice.
lot of the heart and lungs.
Yep.
So that'll be a year, and I'll be wrapping that up this coming summer, and then taking a future job.
Very cool. So how did you get like first involved in this field that we both love from, very similar and very different angles? Like where did you first hear about it? Where did your interest really stem from?
Right. I think like a lot of us, there'd always been some level of kind of like baseline nerdery and some kind of space interests as a child. Watched a lot of Star Trek growing up. My personal statement for medical school applications was actually about Star Trek and the character of Bones McCoy and how he played a role in choosing to go to medicine. As an aside, it's actually something that the actor who played that role, DeForest Kelley, said was the most gratifying part of his job was knowing and hearing from so many people that even though he played this role as a space medicine physician, he inspired a lot of actual people to pursue a career in medicine. So after writing that statement, I chose Baylor, and one part of why I did was because they had this space medicine pathway. I wasn't aware of the existence of this sort of specialty, this interest, and I thought this would be a great opportunity. Those 4 years, so I did do that as a medical student. It's a pathway that's a combination of didactics and research and networking opportunities with a bunch of folks at Baylor's Center for Space Medicine and the organization, which is now Trish. The For those that don't know, the kind of the translational research arm for NASA. So that was my first exposure to it. I did some kind of hands-on research work with that, looking at the problem that is now known as SANS, so the spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome. We were looking at internal jugular vein distensibility under ultrasound. And so, interestingly enough, I got involved in that before I had chosen radiology, and the sort of hands-on ultrasound experience there was my kind of first exposure to radiology, something that by the end of med school I decided would be my future field. And so Having those two interests and carrying it forward, I decided, like you said, to pursue residency out at Stanford. And after making that transition, I tried to carry along some of these space medicine interests on the side, remain involved, worked on a few different projects and papers, and especially over the last 2 to 3 years, have sort of tried to ramp up the amount of time and effort I'm devoting to that field as well, and have really, especially in the last 6 to 12 months, gotten involved in a number of projects that look at that area of overlap between medical imaging and human spaceflight.
So if you were to kind of, if you were to say like, how does one become like get to where you are? How would you? I have my own answer for this, but I'm curious on what you would say to people listening to this. Like, how does one become a space radiologist?
Yeah, I think to some extent, especially a lot of us in our early career and even later, are still actually figuring that out, especially for something like space radiology, where it's a field that's sort of during its phase of invention. In terms of how to get involved in space medicine more broadly, and then this in particular, I think the first step is that wherever you are in your academic career, look around you at the institution you're at and try and figure out, is anyone working on anything already, especially for people who are in undergrad or in medical school. I think it's difficult to pull in grants, to publish independently, though it can be done. So I think the first is to look locally to see who's involved, see how you might be able to help or collaborate with them. I think that's a good introduction to something that can then get you a poster, get you a publication, and then leverage those opportunities to try and attend some of the national meetings, because those are great networking opportunities to then get involved with others and kind of learn to how to chart a career. I think, um, as you and others have set up, there's a lot of fantastic online resources and communities now, as well, that weren't even there, 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, when some of us were starting. Um, and so I think learning of opportunities that way, either on your Discord, or Twitter, or through many other resources, I think that there's a lot of information out there, both for projects that might be looking for people, but also things like more defined programs, and some of those include the Johnson Space Center clerkship for those who are fourth year in medical school or in residency. That's something that I was fortunate enough to complete myself, just a couple years ago, and enjoyed it immensely. But then there are also short courses offered by both UTMB and NASA for people in undergrad, medical school, and even later. And so I think some of those posted opportunities are also excellent ways of starting to form some of those connections. And then eventually you kind of can parlay those into positions, whether or not it's getting a grant and looking for positions in academia, or pursuing something like an aerospace medicine residency. Or if it's something where it's just a research interest that you have on the side in private practice as a physician. I know individuals who have taken all these different routes. So I think there's more than one way of getting there. But I think the first two steps are look online and look locally.
But wait, there's not just like a thing that I can just hop into a residency and become a space radiologist? You're saying it's this organic, networking style, and bring yourself up, kind of make it as you go type of thing. That, ah, man, it's not straightforward.
It's both intimidating but also exciting. The ability to sort of chart your path and try and define what you want to make of it. I think there's already a lot of wonderful people working on medical imaging and space flight that come from a variety of training backgrounds. But I think we need more, and I think that this is a great kind of open question and open field, and it's there for kind of the next generation to come in and define it, and answer some of those problems.
Yeah, I think when we first met, so we first met at the asthma in Reno, which was 2 years ago now. You said something that is still stuck with me, which was, do what specialty you want to do first, but then find a way to keep the flame alive. I remember that specifically, and I I think it sticks with me because I think it's so important to go out and do whatever specialty you know are most interested first, develop those skills, become an expert in whatever you want to do, and then just kind of on the side be able to kind of um, develop and get involved as a secondary kind of aim. I think that's like a really important thing for a lot of people to understand when they try and get into this field.
Right. I think it's a good point, and I think kind of some of the reasons underlying that too are you know you can complete any of these residencies, and you know aerospace medicine residencies will still take you whether or not it's you're coming from OB-GYN, from radiology. You're still eligible if you completed some of these residencies. So even if you decide you want to practice clinically aerospace medicine later on, some of these residency programs are still really good preparation for that. And I think the other thing is that as space medicine grows over the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to need more specialist expertise. Everything in medicine is getting more subspecialized, and this included. And so I think choosing what else you're passionate about is a good kind of preparatory framework and can give you a unique background to contribute to some of these problems in ways that maybe other people haven't been able to so far.
Yeah, I think many people, when they look their first glance at space medicine, they often look and say, oh, there's one job to be done, and that is emergency medicine, aerospace medicine residency, flight surgery. That's like the most well beaten path. And I think what you're bringing up is there's actually many, many, many other jobs that support the medical component of what NASA's doing, what private space companies are doing, and they're going to need expertise from everyone. So on my third year medical school rotations, I would always, you know, sometimes more blatant than others, be like, oh yeah, this is interesting. I've been thinking about X, Y, and Z problem from this specialty in regards to how people in space are going to relate to it. And they're like, huh, I didn't know that was a field. So it just kind of goes to show that eventually everyone's going to be involved. It just depends on, and they're going to have all these unique problems. And we're going to, there's so much to be learned and so much to be invented and thought about that it just hasn't been done yet. There's so much work to do.
Exactly. I think it takes a village, and it will take an increasingly diverse village in the future to kind of advance the field. And I think the other thing here is I'm a strong believer in the idea that don't try to become great at just one thing. Try and become great at two things, and maybe two things that not a lot of people are simultaneously great at, because I think it's that overlap where you can often add the most value. And so that's why I especially think that you know, choosing different undergrad majors, choosing different residencies, charting a path where you can build a broader skill set and a background and a perspective that's maybe different than others who have trod that path before. I think like you're saying, it can be very helpful.
Do you have any thoughts on like what you would have studied differently now, like knowing or where you're at now? You've gained, you know, your own perspective on the field of space medicine. Looking back on it, what would you have thought about your career differently?
I don't think so. I it's a good question. It's something that I ask myself a lot. I would 100% choose radiology again. I love this field. I love the day to day. I love the work, and it makes a fantastic day job. It's something that I think is flexible and is always interesting. And so I would very much pick radiology again. Um, in terms of like stepping back even farther, undergrad's an interesting question. I think I wouldn't, and I admittedly had a somewhat atypical major for people coming into medical school, which was I studied
Earth
environmental
science?
geosciences,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and you know oceanography minor. I worked on coastal processes, but I think it's one of those things where I don't use that as much in you know my day to day work anymore. But I think what I learned still has an impact on how I think. So there's a lot of systems level thinking in the geosciences. A lot of what I studied and worked on was the interplay of like very large scale processes between, the atmosphere, the oceans, the biosphere. And so I think that understanding even things like feedback mechanisms and flowchart, like understanding at a systems level how something works and how something tweaking it can affect downstream processes is something that I learned a lot in undergrad, but that still very much affects how I think about medicine now. And so I think that there are heuristics, there are skills that translate from one field to another, even if the actual the material is pretty disparate between the two.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel like they have to study or get a degree that says certain things for them to feel like that they're able to get into whatever field. And to some extent that can be true, but I think what you bring up is important, that other fields, especially in space medicine, are it is so rewarding to bring in outside information and expertise to people that are really hungry for it. They're really looking for people that can think about things in a new way and engineer and to do science and to bring all these different people to the party, because that hasn't been really done in a lot of circumstances.
Right. And so that's something that I hope I can do more of in the future as well, as someone who wants to remain plugged in within, the radiology sphere and attend the radiology meetings. I think there's a lot that if you're very up to date on whatever field you're in, you can take that and see the potential applications within aerospace medicine, that people working solely within aerospace medicine are doing a fantastic job, but they don't have time to attend every single conference for every single specialty out there and catch every single new tech development or every new publication. And so I think it helps that you can be there to sort of translate um, the ongoing work that is not space medicine targeted um, in these various specialties, and then bring that and apply it within aerospace medicine.
Yeah, it sounds like you haven't really done any aerospace medicine work, but you have all these papers you were just telling me about. So, um, you're like, oh, aerospace medicine, what other people do, but you've done plenty of work yourself.
It's a start, but it's there's hopefully so much more to come. I think that there I finally like that feeling of being at the point where the list of projects I want to start and the ideas I have is much longer than what I have sort of the time and the resources to work on. I feel like I bring that up because I felt like for a lot of my career up to this point, I didn't know enough to know what questions are open or unanswered, or kind of what projects are worth biting off or haven't already been addressed. And recently, you get to a point in your training where you get pretty far in residency. You find your niche, you find the thing that you're passionate about. You read up on it. You can finally start to get to the point where you realize really what needs to be asked, what needs to be answered. And then that's where you can kind of start to independently contribute or find collaborators to work on things. And so the last year or two has been the start of that process, and I've had fantastic co-authors and PIs and such that I've been very privileged to work with on these several papers on a variety of topics. And I think that there's a lot of potential for a lot of these ideas going forward, because each good experiment usually sets up the next few. So
Yeah, and one of your good ideas was to write a newsletter. So I can thank you for planting that little seed in my putting that little bug in my ear. So
no,
that
I'm
was
I'm glad that you took that and ran with it. I've gotten to read it each month, and there's always a huge percentage of it that I missed. I didn't catch it when it came out, and so it's always a nice little treat to see that on X or Twitter or whatever.
whatever
Uh,
whatever the
when I
kids are
log
calling
in.
it these days.
Yeah, it still feels a little bit strange to call it X. Maybe it'll settle
Yeah,
out.
it's a little. they had such a good brand, you know, the blue, you know, bird, and I mean, call it whatever you want, but I thought their branding was great, and now it's little not so good.
Yeah, still trying to figure out what's the new word for a tweet. Like what is it, a post now? I don't know.
Yeah, but that's so generic, you know.
Right.
They had such a
Right.
good thing going. Anyway, but yeah, I think briefly talking about some of you know the specifics of your project, you know, nothing too crazy, but just like the general overview of how some of these ideas, you know, what questions were asked and how you went about it would be awesome.
Yeah, fantastic. I'd love to. So two that I can touch on that are at this kind of overlap of um, medical imaging for space flight and uh, that kind of radiology aerospace medicine overlap are um, one paper that a project that I worked on with David Lerner and a couple others from a few years ago, where we looked at this question of, can you take individuals that are procedurally naive? And so what we mean by that is someone who hasn't done interventional work before, something like ultrasound guided drain placements, those sorts of things, or hasn't had any formalized training in it, doesn't routinely perform it. Can you take someone like that, and can you teach them in 5 minutes, and then give them live guidance and walk them through doing a procedure like that from a distance? And the reason this is a big question is because we anticipate that eventually on exploration class missions, an astronaut will eventually develop a surgical condition, or potentially a medical condition. We may not have the capability to do open or laparoscopic surgery when this occurs. Now, the question is, what capabilities might we have short of that on any given mission that would allow us to intervene in a way that manages this adequately? And one of the sort of paradigms for how to treat these is essentially interventional radiology. You take an ultrasound probe, a needle, a wire, and a catheter, and you can stick a drain in almost anything. And you know, whether or not that's a percutaneous abscess, an intra-abdominal abscess, whether it's a dilated collecting system in the setting of hydronephrosis, you can put a drain in it. And so our question is that we you know, as of now, there has never been an interventional radiologist in the astronaut corps. We don't necessarily anticipate that there would be on one of these missions for the crew medical officer. And so the question is, if they haven't been trained in something like this, and training time is a premium before any mission, could you take them and walk them through this? Could you teach them and walk them through? And so we took about 30 individuals who were mostly like residents starting out, who had not done IR yet, or techs, people who might have eventual training in this at a later time, but had not yet. And we took a control group of trained interventional radiologists, and we took those who were procedurally naive and had them watch a 4-minute pre-recorded video. And then via a Zoom call, just like we're on now, via live audiovisual guidance. We had someone from 700 miles away walk them through putting in a drain using standard techniques from IR on a simulated abscess inside a phantom. So in other words, it's a human torso made of essentially ballistics gel. We made an abscess in and hid it. And so no one was harmed in the conducting of this experiment. But what we found was pretty startling, at least to me, which is that we had 100% success rate on taking these 29 individuals. We found that at least with live communication, that after at least one or two, redirections, if necessary, they were able to place the drain consistently into the simulated abscess, which is really exciting, because this very much simulates something that could happen on a future mission.
So one of the things that comes to mind that's, you know, I'm already thinking ahead, but what is the if you were to guess, like what is the minimum viable connection time lag or speed or whatever metric you want to use that you would think that you would need to complete one of these procedures? Like you said it was live essentially over Zoom, relatively instantaneous connection, but I can imagine that it's going to fall off a cliff if you have time delay or if you have kind of low resolution, that kind of thing.
So it's an excellent question, and admittedly, I won't go too far into it. We have ongoing work to answer just that, because I
Okay,
think that
cool.
that is the $1 million question, and it's the experimental arm that we didn't have time to do for this. So yes, that work is underway. Hopefully, we'll have some answers for you within maybe a year or so. But
Hey,
um,
I'm expecting it. I'm expecting to see that paper.
that idea is in the works, because it is a good question. People have looked at it for some sort of laparoscopic work. There's been some presentations before. But it's a big question, because what we found was that these people who had no idea how to do it, they did require a lot on step-by-step guidance. So this was we had the co-author, the PI on the project, very, very clearly announcing each step, checking to make sure the step was completed appropriately, then proceeding to the next one. And so with live guidance, that can proceed very, very easily. When you um, when you introduce a time delay, it obviously gets very disrupted. And the interesting question too is like you kind of hinted at, is how much communications delay, how much latency kind of breaks the system. And that's important because even the communications delay to the lunar surface, I have not seen a totally finalized number, but I've heard things in the range of potentially like round trip communications delays of like 10 seconds. And so even though the moon is 1 light second away, that does not mean our communications network can transmit in that amount of time. And so I think it'll be very interesting if even those sorts of brief delays kind of slows us down enough where you can't course correct before there's a problem. Obviously, just something like the Martian surface, we're talking, at least 5 to 10 minutes to potentially 40, with, 1 to 2 week blackouts for periods of time. And so that even is a whole nother can of worms,
Yeah.
where this would have to be more or less autonomous, because if you have a procedure like this, or a drastically changed procedure, I should say, because we had something like 13, 14 steps realistically. With that communications delay, you couldn't do it the same way. And so I think it'll be a very interesting question to see how these sorts of things get adapted, how training schema get adapted to allow for greater autonomy. But depending on the communications delay at the time when something were to occur on the Martian surface, you might still have relatively quick ground backup for at least for some sorts of questions and interpretations.
Yeah, I think it is surprising that you got 100%, but I'm wondering, you know, you had essentially educated, you know, people somewhat within the field, like residents, like medically educated people. Does this change from like the civilian spaceflight context? Like, would you estimate like a non-NASA mission um, would change that percentage?
I think that I think what would change that percentage to the greatest degree is exactly what training background and how up to date the training is of whoever the crew medical officer on any mission is. And so whoever is the one performing this procedure, what at the end of the day matters is their skill set. And if they've had any skill atrophy since last performing anything like this. And so I imagine on a civilian, any civilian expedition, it would again come down to who do they have performing this. I think certainly that the cohort that we took, certain like they all have college educated, and they have some exposure in the medical field. Many of them had at least seen an ultrasound probe before. So they had some conceptual idea of maybe what was occurring, even though they hadn't performed it. I think taking the average layperson off the street, certainly they would have less background in it, but I'm not sure it would be that drastically different. I think the thing that would change it more is if you introduce a comms delay. If you introduced a patient that starts hemorrhaging or that is writhing in pain or that has a smaller abscess than we simulated. I think there are a number of ways that this could become more challenging, and then certainly the level of training and experience and how to manage some of that would matter a great deal. My hunch.
Yeah. Another question that kind of comes to mind that or more of just a comment, like, did you learn anything about making just in time trainings as a result of this? Because the concept of, you know, having a astronaut of whatever type, receive something from the ground in the event of X, Y, and Z, consequences or circumstances, to train them up for a particular scenario that they're going to encounter. That's across like many aspects of mission dynamics, it seems. So did you learn anything from like doing that telecommunication or guiding someone through a screen that could be useful for other just in time trainings?
Yeah, good question. I'll preface this by saying that there's also a lot of literature out there for teleguidance, for procedural work, and for diagnostic ultrasound as well. Um, there's a lot of use for it in rural areas, in polar research stations, etc., where they've looked at the best methodology for doing it. We were sort of limited in terms of how we could do it by the resources that we had available. And so as we were sort of experimenting within the realm of possibilities for how we would best construct this guidance system, a few of the things that we found were having, which is sort of obvious to start, having truly live communication that didn't have any sort of static or interruptions was really really important. If you lost it, especially with this cohort that hadn't performed these before, they would often become very confused very quickly. We'd have to get it back up and running. And so we had to, for one patient, had to be excluded just because the internet system went down for too long. And certainly, so the technical component is there, just in terms of the communication system needing to have consistent uptime. I think the other thing that we learned was really important was that stepwise approach. When we tried to, from previous work that he's done, when you try and combine too many steps together, it gets too complicated. It's hard for them to kind of process all that and execute on it. And so it's really important, this whole, you show them a video at the start so they have a broad idea, but then telling them step by step and then checking and verifying that each step has occurred appropriately before proceeding with the next one. And as part of that too is how you have your cameras and your communication system set up. And what I mean by that is it's really important for us, when we were positioning all the equipment, that the guider at a distance be able to both see the ultrasound screen and see the person actually performing the drain placement. So they need to be able to see the drain. They need to be able to see the patient well. They need to be able to see the operator's hands, but then they also need to be able to see the location of the probe and then the screen for the ultrasound system. And so we did that with using multiple webcams, using multiple different views. Obviously, you can design systems where the ultrasound images are wirelessly transmitted to the guider, and so they get a better view that way. But we literally just used a webcam, a few feet away, that captured everything in one field of view. But that's really important so that the guider has an idea of exactly what everyone is seeing and where all the parts are at any given time.
Yeah, there's so much like uncommunicated, like thinking about a procedure based on like the positioning of the patient relative to the hand angle versus how to position yourself towards the screen all at the same time. And I think there's a lot of like, you can tell where you could probably tell where the operator, what they wanted to do next. And so you could correct them, um, if you had like a good view of what their body language is essentially telling you in that field.
Right. And you can tell them to back off, you can tell them to adjust, as long as you can see where their hands are and also what the ultrasound, what the, the image that you're getting from the probe looks like. You can kind of have an idea of telling them proceed or slow down on any given step while they're trying to do it. And
Mm-hmm.
even with this, like, a decent number of the operators required a redirection. So they had to, remove the needle and try again because the angle, the approach, whatever, was off.
Did you
Um,
characterize that data at all?
yeah, so well, for the redirections, we counted the number of times that it occurred. We also recorded time to completion as two of the main metrics, and then just technical success, which we viewed as a binary. Um, the percent that required a redirect was relatively low. I think the mean was like, well, 0.1 redirections per participant. So it was just a couple. Um, and even in our control group of professionally trained interventional radiologists, I think one of them had a redirection, as I recall. So it's something that happens, and depending on exactly where you placed it the first time, obviously on a phantom, it doesn't injure anyone, but you don't want to place in too drastically incorrect a position, even on a first one, because even if you recognize it, you can redirect afterwards. You don't want to have already hit bowel or something else.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a really, really cool project, and it's applicable to, something that is going to be happening. It seems like it would be really applicable to the Artemis missions. Seems like, it's in like the lunar missions would be right square into what this may be useful for. And one of the things that I'm kind of curious about is how did this project start? Like, where did the a lot of people, they have these ideas, but they don't know how to make them happen. So how did
Well,
this project really come to be?
well, there all the credit is to David Lerner. So he's someone I had met again through conferences, introductions, etc. And he's a full attending radiologist who's been working on space medicine topics and specifically space radiology for like over a decade now. And so this is a project he had already had underway at another institution, and so the idea is his, and I jumped on as sort of the junior resident, helping out, and so I established kind of a second location for the work, where I was at Stanford, and recruited a bunch of folks there and set up a second site so that he could guide them there as well. So this is something that I myself didn't initiate, but was lucky to kind of join a project in progress that needed some help. And so that's why I think, kind of tying it back to earlier, I think that networking and just meeting people and seeing who around you or even at other institutions is just looking for help or could use a hand. Um,
Yeah, I think that's, the big take home for that I found early on is find someone who's doing work in your field and just get to know them as best you can. Like, a lot of the work normally comes from people that have either grant money, that have a lab is otherwise looking at something else most of the time, but have a little bit of NASA funding, or like a physician, who's really interested in the field, and has all of the technology. And as you brought up in the very beginning, like, has developed the right questions after like a career in their specific specialty that has really allowed them to focus in on something that's like an unanswered question and that's also important.
right, right. Very much agree. And of these papers, like you were talking about that have come out recently, like all of them involved me contacting someone who already had an idea or someone more senior, PI, whatever, and getting involved picking up an idea and running with it that they had. Those sorts of things I think are really good ways to start out as a med student, resident, etc. It's kind of it's you don't necessarily know right off the bat what isn't known,
Yeah. I've
and
run
that makes
into
it
a lot
challenging.
of like high school students, undergraduates at various conferences and online, and they really don't know like how to get, how did your name end up on this paper?
Right.
And it just, it's something you have to build over time. You have to, end up emailing, just start trying to do stuff, see who's doing it, figure it out, like, start, um, going to conferences if you can. A lot of them are online, especially in the space medicine world, and a lot of them are free. So a lot of those barriers are down, although there still are plenty of barriers that are still up. But I think just getting involved and talking to the right people is really always step one. And just go out there, and they're on the internet somewhere. So
Yep. Yep. 100%. It's you got to do a lot of that legwork, and then after that, it's just about professional relationships. I think like a lot of stuff work related. It's about who you know and and how to get to know more people, build that network, find opportunities that way. Because there's a lot of people who are very well informed and have a lot of work ongoing, and it's just finding connecting with the right folks.
yeah. So that was really good. I don't think I've read this paper before, so thank you for kind of going over it with me. Can you we kind of shift gears to maybe your second paper on the X-ray imaging in simulated microgravity? This maybe highlights, at least from our kind of offline discussions, what are the big roadblocks that kind of come up in the field? Like, what are the challenges that you've faced? Like, what are some of the things that give you the biggest headaches in the work that you've done?
I think like broadly speaking, I think what's already becoming apparent, and it's true for everyone in academics as a whole. It's a lot of it is you have ideas, but it's you need time to do it. You need expertise, and beyond that, for a lot of this work, it requires funding. And so finding opportunities for that, there are many out there, but finding the right opportunities and then having the time to apply for grants, et cetera, I think is a big sort of a hurdle. And there are organizations like Trish and such that have done a really good job of trying to reduce this hurdle. But I think that's like the activation energy to start a project is just it comes down to time and money. So I think once you can kind of pass that, then it's a lot of project specific issues. And so this is something this project here, the X-ray imaging and the simulated microgravity environment of parabolic flight was one where the PIs David Lerner and Shana Gifford, and then the great folks from MinX-ray, a portable X-ray manufacturer, they had spent a lot of time over multiple years. Applying for flight time, trying to do all the safety work, getting it certified. It was a lot of effort on their part to pull this flight off with this equipment. And so, now as we're carrying this forward and looking for next steps for what we do with portable radiography, it's a lot of the same things. It's flying anything in space is incredibly expensive. And so even though you might have a great idea, you think you can pull it off, it's about finding the right opportunities, and justifying that cost. And so I think that for a lot of the work that gets done, that's a big hurdle. Hopefully, it becomes more accessible for science in the future as, cost to orbit, you know, cross our fingers, decreases over the next 10 to 20 years. But it still is, you got to have a really good reason to wanna fly something. And I think that applies to a lot of work.
Yeah, I had a brief discussion with Dr. Gifford, who is a physical medicine and rehabilitation physician at either WashU or St. Louis University. I talked to her at the New Orleans Asthma, and the reason I brought up like a lot of the difficulties is in her talk she brought up a lot of the headache in getting this, getting this machine to a parabolic flight. Just a lot of hesitancy from the actual airline company, and just kind of the spaceflight community to bring something as kind of like a black box, like something that they didn't really understand how it worked, and they had a lot of safety concerns, and probably a little bit of like a cultural um, uh, dissonance between like medicine and aviation that didn't allow the project to like kind of progress as you may expect, because you can tell someone, hey, this machine, if it malfunctions, it's it's just it's inert, or it's no issue. But an airline pilot, they might be a little bit more skeptical of that kind of information. So she was just kind of talking about it and brought up how hard it was to get this project like off the ground, and to get this machine flying, even though it presented no risk to anyone really.
Yeah, and that's sort of what I was alluding to. But yeah, she and the rest of the team did a lot of work to get this through all the various approval stages. Because like you said, it's something that they don't regularly fly. In fact, no one's flown any sort of radiograph equipment of any kind, and not this technology, not digital, etc., since like the 70s when John West did it. And so this is something that definitely needed some convincing that this was safe. It wasn't going to irradiate everyone. It wasn't going to pose this massive hazard. And it's understandable on their point that they're very concerned, they're very safety oriented, and that's important too. So it's incumbent upon us as well to be very familiar with the equipment and to be able to explain clearly and thoughtfully why it doesn't pose the sorts of large risks that someone not in radiology might assume. And I think that that'll be a continuing kind of it'll be a continuing challenge for us going forward, as for those of us working in this sphere of space radiology, is communicating well risks related to ionizing radiation, risks related to imaging hardware, because a lot of people rightfully have a lot of hesitance about a lot of it. And I'll add to that point that specifically on the point of ionizing radiation in the setting of radiography, I think we in radiology have to emphasize how much we've been able to decrease doses over prior versions of a lot of the equipment that we use, and kind of communicate that in the language that people understand. Things like, you get a chest X-ray now, and the amount of radiation you receive is, you know, what you'd get from several international flights, or even less than that, depending on the technique used. And so I think putting it in terms that people understand, and can make sort of risk benefit decisions that are right for them, I think is important.
I have a little bit of an aside, um, but what I've found whenever I've communicated like the radiation risk for human spaceflight, I often use chest X-ray as like the unit. So I think it's the thing, like the factoid I have is, I think one day on the ISS is equivalent to 4 chest X-rays or something like that.
Right. And that's like a rough amount. Again, I sort of, I sometimes describe it in the number of flights. I think it also depends a lot on the equipment that you use, 1 or 2 views, size of the patient. And so we use these like very rough estimates of like zero point 0.1 millisieverts. But if you actually like for a chest radiograph, but if you look at the data, obviously there's going to be some variation there. Um, but generally speaking, it's a lot less than it used to be, and I think that we need to do a better job of communicating risk and benefit with radiology tests as a whole, both to the general public, but and to referring clinicians.
Hmm. Whenever I've talked to someone who has worked at NASA, they often say NASA is an engineering company, not a hospital and not a university. And so a lot of their problems come with communicating to folks that have that particular background. Have you noticed like any particular words or units or any particular heuristics or rules of thumb that really kind of unlock people to understanding what you may be talking about as a radiologist?
Um, yeah, I think it depends on kind of who your audience is. And so that's why often we'll use the equivalent to number of flights, or saying a chest X-ray is the same as the amount of radiation you get in about 10 days of just background radiation walking around, things like that. For the true lay person, it kind of they can kind of conceptualize it more easily than saying giving a millisievert, which means very. You're right that the language of NASA for most things is engineering. And so I think it's incumbent upon us who are not engineers to be better systems thinkers and to try and better communicate ideas using that language and that perspective. Because physicians and engineers don't always think the same way. They have different kind of mental crutches and different ways that they talk about problems. And so I think to the extent that we're able to quantify and express medical risk and medical conditions in language that is familiar to engineers, I think it helps a lot. Um, and so I think that that's some of the challenge in communicating um, the uncertainties and the vagaries of medicine, because we don't have a subject that can always be perfectly modeled or that we understand perfectly, that can't be necessarily like tested in a computer. um, and so we sometimes um, lack the sort of quantification or estimations that would be helpful, and that's kind of like a broad point, and I think that it's incumbent upon us to try and address that to whatever extent is possible.
Yeah, I think it probably can't be understated what you just brought up, which is effective communication of, you know, what we as medical backgrounded people can give to the spaceflight community is that perspective. And we have our own mental coaches, we have our own, faults at hand, but just to bring our point of view most effectively to spacecraft design, to medical capabilities, to understanding what risks there are, and how to think about prevention versus treatment in flight. Those are all things that we have, you know, a little bit better perspective on than anyone else in terms of medical risks. So I
Yeah,
think bringing that about in an effective way is, I think it's part of the reason that I like doing these podcasts is it brings it's trying to showcase what how a radiologist thinks about space medicine and bring it to more and more people, and to kind of understand what's going on, and to kind of bring that perspective out in the world as much as I can.
I think it's an admirable goal. It needs to be done. And on that point of medical risk, like luckily we have a lot of brilliant folks out there working on this, and there's ever increasing literature coming out of NASA EXMC and others looking at how to better quantify medical risk, how to use systems-based engineering methods to try to break down and analyze what we do day to day in a clinical setting without thinking about it in those terms. But if we can sort of translate how we practice medicine into the sort of models um, that are used on the engineering side, it allows us to better prepare these missions to deal with medical mission risk and better justify and select equipment to send with them. And so I think it's an absolute critical task that luckily a lot of those folks are working on.
Yeah, so just to kind of back up a little bit, you were referring to the NASA XMC, which is the Exploration Medicine Capability, I believe is that the right
Yeah, especially in medical capability.
Yeah. So that's a whole section of NASA that is, I believe it's still under the Human Research Program or HRP,
Yes, I believe so.
but it is it is aside from the essentially the in-flight, like the aerospace medicine physicians um, doing clinical care. They're thinking about like probabilities and risks and engineering um, of mission profiles, that kind of thing. So it's a whole other section of how a physician or how a medically minded person can get involved in space medicine that I was unfamiliar with until until probably you brought you had introduced me, and you had I'd stumbled upon them on the internet. So just goes to show you how many different types of roles that a physician as well as other medically minded people can get into.
Right, right. I think that there's a lot of people doing a lot of fantastic work, both on the op side of like the day-to-day care of the astronauts, and then people who are more involved in the planning out the capabilities and doing the medical systems design for future missions. And I think you need both sides of that. Those focused on the clinical care of today, and then the people planning for tomorrow. Um, and so yeah, I think lots and lots of ways to get involved.
I think in terms of like, if I were to guess, the percentage of jobs that are space medicine physicians, like people that are taking care of astronauts versus non, I think it would probably be like 90% are in the other category. So there's much more work to be done in terms of the research side, the engineering side. Um, so that's why I often tell people or kind of guide people to explore what research questions are interesting to you within the field, find someone who can mentor you through it. And that's probably the best way to get involved starting out, because taking care of an operational mission, you have to not only have gone through all of your medical training, but also have found yourself in a position to be taking care of the astronaut. So it's that is way down the line, if ever a lot of people get to do that. Um, so it's getting involved through research and thinking about these problems is probably the first and foremost thing, because the access to clinical care for however X many number of astronauts there are is much less.
I, I I certainly think that's true. I think there's certainly a lot of work to be done away from the clinical day to day, and I think though that in the future, hopefully we'll see that um, that sort of ratio change slightly too as more and more people fly. I think there'll be more demand for even not necessarily in-flight support, but those supporting on the ground, things like launch and landing support, prehabilitation, rehabilitation, um, longitudinal care, like pre and post flight. So I think that there'll be more and more opportunities on the clinical side too, as the sort of astronaut pool hopefully grows in the next decades. But I think you're really right that I think the way if you want to start to contribute, a good way of doing it is, yeah, looking at some of the research questions that are outstanding and the red risks and the things that NASA has identified as like these are the gaps in our knowledge that we need to find an answer to. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
my homepage, whenever I like start up a new Chrome browser, is the HRP gaps page. So the Human Research Program gaps, and NASA has a whole, um, I think it's like 10 pages now of what they've done all the work. they've they have thought very long and hard about what are the issues that we think are important and what do we not understand. And here they are, well laid out, nice graphics, and very well referenced material. Um, and you can just look at them. So if you type in HRP gaps, and you type in your favorite organ in the body or your favorite medical issue, there is probably something that they don't know, and they is probably a way that you would write a grant to NASA saying, hey, you have this gap, I'm looking to fulfill it doing X, Y, and Z experiment. And it's an incredible resource that is just sitting there on the internet if you know where to look.
Yep. Yep. I completely agree. I think, and it addresses the sort of concern that I had before, which is like when you start off, it's hard to know what collectively isn't known. And so I think that that's a great kind of compass pointing you in the right direction of what sorts of problems to think about. And 100% back up what you say about it guiding like grant proposals. It's something that we were just talking about with respect to a potential grant application a week or two ago. It's like, which of these risks can we um, help address with this work? Like, what does this apply to? Which of these could it buy down if we're successful? So definitely a good way of framing future projects.
So we're approaching about an hour-ish of recording. So um, any like future-looking things, where is space radiology going? Where, what are the, for yourself or for the field? And what is like kind of what is the end goal for space radiology? Where's kind of the short view and the long view?
I think that is a that's for someone like me, that's the $1 million question. And I think I have part of the answer now. And I think part of the answer is still to come. And because that answer has to be developed with colleagues who are interested in working on these same topics. And the reason that I say it like that is because I think those of us working on medical imaging and spaceflight need to sort of define what space radiology is. Like it's the subset of aerospace medicine, obviously, and it overlaps with radiology, but um, sort of like what are the biggest problems that we can contribute to, and how do we conceptualize our field, especially those of us who are clinical radiologists and have that expertise to share. And so this is something that I hopefully in the next like 12 months there'll be kind of some more opportunities out there that will be showcasing about how those people who are involved in or interested in radiology and spaceflight can get involved. But I think one of the ways I'm starting to think about it is what are the ways that we can apply imaging pre-flight, in-flight, and post-flight. And so I think some of the big questions conceptually ask is how can we use imaging to screen astronauts in the future for exploration class missions? How should we do that? What are the things we should be looking for? How do we prevent over intervention or over screening? And how do we balance that with the ability to buy down risk? I think it's not just screening for selection, but also screening for things like what might be predisposing factors for various conditions that they may develop, and how to prehabilitate someone before mission. In light of those, I think the next sort of big category is then you shift to in-flight, which is how do we perform imaging studies in flight? So how do we do that autonomously when communication is not feasible or not real time? How do we do it with guidance? How do we use imaging both to diagnose pathology, and how do we use imaging to intervene? I think the next thing is what pathology should we be imaging for regularly in flight in terms of screening? And then what pathology should we be ready to diagnose should a certain clinical scenario arise? I think another question is what modalities may be available, particularly down the road. Um, how do we push ultrasound beyond what we've already done? How do we adapt advanced ultrasound techniques to the spaceflight environment? And then how do we kind of prepare, prove, and adapt things like radiography for potential use in the future, either in flight or on another terrestrial surface? And then I think imaging has a role post-flight. So for launch and landing support, how do we train our providers to be able to use, POCUS ultrasound, point of care ultrasound, to potentially manage suboptimal landing conditions or pathology that develops upon landing? How do we use imaging to detect changes from pre-flight baseline imaging? And what might those results say about spaceflight physiology? And there's a lot of people who've already, been working on that. Fantastic work from Larry Kramer and Donna Roberts and others, looking at a lot of the neuro changes. So I think there are these broad buckets of sort of what might be in the overarching field of space radiology, and I think there are so many questions under each of these that still need to be worked out.
Yeah, I think I'll be obviously preaching to the choir, but radiology is kind of the backbone of most every medical specialty. It in a way you can have a hospital without a radiology department. And when you think about astronauts, they often are treated by emergency physicians. And in the emergency department, one of the first things you get pretty much going through the door is an X-ray or a CT, that kind of thing, as well as ultrasound. And today, I think you may have brought this up, but there has never been an X-ray done in space. That I think that's true, or you've told me that
Correct.
before.
They no nothing beyond ultrasound, and for of what we consider the traditional radiology imaging methods, nothing beyond ultrasound has been performed. That is correct. There
Yeah,
obviously there's been like OCT, there's been other types of imaging, but no radiography has ever been performed in space flight, even in suborbital or orbital flight.
yeah. So to kind of bring us back full circle to get us to that to Bones, like to our Star Trek future that we all hope and dream for. How do we get to that, tricorder? How do we become space medicine physicians um, with more modalities? Is that going to happen? Do we need it?
I think for for our goals long term in space to be met, the sort of lofty things that we talk about of permanent bases on the lunar surface or on Mars, it's not even optional. It has to happen. We cannot provide um, a high level of care for large populations on another terrestrial surface without radiology. It doesn't happen well on Earth, and it's not going to happen there. Even in our polar research stations in Antarctica, they have radiography available. So this is something that I think is an inevitability if we're going to make the sort of progress with human spaceflight that I think we all hope for. And so I think it's an excellent opportunity for those interested to really be able to contribute.
I think you're pretty well positioned as someone who's been involved, knows a lot of the networks, but is also maybe coming from not within NASA, to affect your this point of view that you have maximally.
I hope so. I hope I have something to contribute. Um, it's certainly a goal of mine. I hope I have this long career ahead of me. But I think that there's already so many people who have paved the way and worked on these topics, and I'm hopeful that there will be even more to come, and I can be one part of that global effort to advance this field.
Yeah, well, I certainly appreciate you kind of taking the time today just to hang out and talk about your work. We have met at ASMA back in Reno 2 years ago, but met again in New Orleans. And I hope you make it down to Chicago, where I'm currently located, for number three.
Yeah, hopefully I'll be there. Certainly looking forward to it. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any like kind of closing thoughts, or if you were to teach other aerospace medicine physicians or the general public like one thing about space radiology, like what would you kind of impart upon them?
I think the one thing I want to get out there to everyone and to the audience is that space radiology exists.
that's a that's a that's a very good goal because it's so important and it opens up all the doors and it's yeah, it's perfect. I love it.
It's there and it's already been occurring for decades, done by fantastic people, and it has a bright future. It's not theoretical, it's there. We have to define what it means and work to expand it from here forward.
And I think one of the things I love about space medicine is that your individual effort, because the field is so small, you can easily make a name for yourself and like impart your perspective on a relatively new field. And it's growing so much that our ability to kind of change the course of things feels much more effective than other fields that have been very well developed for many years.
Very much agree. I think that this is just the start, the birth of this field. It's been around now, obviously 60, 70 years, but I think it's still just getting started. And like you said, I think the the amount of change you can have per unit effort for the good is higher than in a lot of other places. And so I think that's something we should all take as very encouraging.
And it's just awesome. I mean, think about like taking X-rays in space and using ultrasound in cool ways, doing like probably being like the first, like doing some of the first procedures are going to be radiology guided, as your research kind of brings up. Probably not doing surgery in space for a long time, but some of the percutaneous stuff like through the skin and other things that radiologists are critical for kind of coordinating, that's gonna be you. Like you're gonna be influencing that, part of this field. And I'm, really excited to see what you do. And I'm happy to have like connected with you when we did. And just thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Feel very much likewise.
All right. Well, we'll catch you in Chicago, and also we'll be chatting with you probably in our Discord here and there. And just yeah, thanks again for your time and your perspective. I always appreciate hearing what you have to say.
Of course, yeah, happy to be here. So glad this worked out.
Finally, meant to
Fine.
blow me off for years. All right. Well, that was Dr. Michael Pohlen, space radiologist extraordinaire and space nerd friend for us here on the Let's Talk Space Medicine podcast. Thanks for joining us.